one of the best things I think for us to do with a lot of new people on boards and commissions is get a good background on, things that can be discussed in meetings, outside of meetings, and just the Freedom of Information Act. Tom is a great resource, and don't hesitate. And he doesn't mind if you reach out to him after this presentation. He'll take questions, of course, but he'll also be glad to get back to you if you have any questions moving on. So without any further, Tom, I'll turn this over to you, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the great attendance tonight, guys. I sometimes say I'd rather do these in person, but on a night like this, I think we're getting more people snug in their homes. So that's great. This is sort of the second round in East Lyme. We did one last month, more for employees, and we had a real good, healthy discussion. Let's hope we can do the same thing tonight. I am the public education officer at the FOI Commission. If those of you who don't know me, do these workshops all over the state. The idea is not to beat you up, not to make you miserable. It's to try to help. It's to try to give you some information, to give you some tools to work with, so that if you have a freedom of information situation, issue, you know what to do, and you also now have a face to put with a voice on the other end. Just a little bit about me. I am not an attorney. I don't know whether that qualifies as good news or bad news, but I share that with you because I can't give you any binding legal opinions. These are not orders. These are not commands from the FOI Commission. I try to teach. I try to help based on 21 plus years at the Commission, talking to our attorneys, watching our Commission in action, seeing different decisions that they've made. So that's the goal tonight. Another thing you should know, I suspect many of you are volunteer members of boards and commissions in East Lyme. A lot of times when I do these sessions, especially in the evening, people say, "Hey, Tom, you don't get it. We're all volunteers. We didn't sign up for this FOI stuff. We signed up to help the town, to help the Board of Finance or the Board of Education or Planning and Zoning." Well, just so you know, I get that too. I was on one board in my town for 10 years. I chaired it for the last 5. I was on our Board of Selectmen for a couple of years, filling out an unexpired term. And then I somehow got roped into another job. I'm on another board now. So I get what it's like to have your life during the day and then have to run to a meeting or get called on a Saturday to do something like that. I understand what that's like. And I understand that, even though I knew something about freedom of information when I got elected or appointed, some of you may not have when you were asked to join your boards or asked to run for office. So what you need to understand is that freedom of information is the law in the state of Connecticut. It goes with the territory. So if you're a public official, a public officer, it's something you need to be aware of, and it's something you need to make sure that you handle if you have requirements or obligations, or also rights under freedom of information. It's a law that is 47 years old now. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 47 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. You had a country that was beside itself with issues, with problems, many caused by serious secrecy, things being done clandestinely behind closed doors. We almost had a constitutional crisis because of all of that. And Ella Grasso was in Congress when Watergate kind of exploded all around us. And she was contemplating this run for governor in Connecticut. And she said, if I run for governor in Connecticut, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have some sort of a law that protects us in Connecticut from what's happening here in Washington. So as you know, she ran and she won. And that's literally one of the first things she did, was put forward the concept for the Freedom of Information Act. And she put it forward, and she said this is really important in January of 1975. And then she did something that was kind of interesting. She said, this law is so important to our state, I will see to it that it is approved unanimously by our legislature. Have you ever watched the legislature? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on this law or on anything? Well, she guaranteed it. She got it. I'm here to tell you, I've seen a video. There wasn't a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. It passed unanimously. Now, that's interesting. It's also instructive as to why we're here tonight. It shows you how important the law was then and remains today. But to get to the point where everybody voted yes, every single legislator voted yes, can you imagine the negotiation? Can you imagine the arm twisting, the back and forth? So you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept: transparency, open government. And then when you try to read it, I suspect some of you have, maybe some of you have tried to read it or try to figure it out, your eyes roll to the back of your head. The wherefores, the whereases, the wait a minute. The law seems to be telling me this, my intuition tells me that. And so you have to be able to interpret it, sometimes on the fly, which brings us back to tonight, where the goal is to try to give you some tools to work with so that if you have to make those kinds of decisions, you know what to do, or you know that you have resources that you can call on to make sure that freedom of information becomes sort of second nature. You're able to do your jobs, concentrate on, the tasks that you're signed up to do to help East Lyme, and not worry constantly looking over your shoulder about freedom of information. The law is called freedom of information, but it's really about access to two basic things: the meetings of public agencies, the records of public agencies. Since most of you are board members, I'm going to spend a lot of time on meetings tonight. But if I don't touch on something that you're interested in, please just jump in, unmute, ask the question. We'll try to answer it. And by the way, I'm never afraid to say I don't know. I know some stuff, but not everything. And I'll be happy to get you an answer down the road. So we talk about freedom of information. One of the first things that I share with people is that it's not really about free information. A lot of people think that it's an invitation to walk into a board meeting or to walk into a town hall office, a police station, and ask, okay, under freedom of information, I have a right to know. Tell me this. How did this happen? Why did that happen? Why was there a cruiser in my neighborhood last night? How did you arrive at that budget figure? Well, folks, we're public servants. We're going to answer questions if we can, but at some point you might have to cut some people off. You might have to say, you know what? Yes, you have a right to know that, but you've got to go to the meeting where that's being discussed. Or you've got to get the records where the information is contained, because it's not my job to interpret things or to try to answer questions for you, whereas I may not have the answer. If that's ever been an issue for you, I want you to think for a minute about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. People call me up and ask for directions. They want to know how to get from point A to point B in Connecticut. They also think that we sit in this giant vault surrounded by every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut, and they think that all they have to do is call us, ask us, and we'll push a button and out come the records. And I have to explain to them that that's not what the FOI Commission does. The FOI Commission does sessions like this. We try to educate, but we also try, to help people. But the biggest job is to make sure that that the law is followed. When the law was passed in 1975, it created the FOI Commission, and the commission's role is if someone believes they've been denied access to things that the law gets them, they file complaints against the public agency with the FOI Commission, and the commission ultimately makes a decision that tells you what to do. But just for a little levity, a couple of weeks ago, I went through, I get 2 or 3 of these a day, emails or phone calls. So how about the West Haven attorney who called me up and asked me to send him the body cam footage from his client's motor vehicle accident in Bridgeport? Where am I supposed to find that? Or the company called Global Zoning in Oklahoma that sent a request 3 times for the impact study of road projects on Main Street in East Hartford. Okay, or the journalism student who asked me to send her all the judges in Connecticut's personal investment disclosure statements. No, that's not what the FOI Commission does. That's not what our job is. Guy calls up a couple of weeks ago. He says, "Sir, I need your help." And I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "I need a copy of my naturalization papers." Your naturalization papers? I said, "Isn't that like a federal thing?" He says, "Yeah, I went to them. They were going to charge me $500. I thought you might have an extra copy lying around." You can't make it up. You can't make it up. So sometimes we have to tell people what FOI is not before we tell them what it is. So access to meetings, access to records. I'm gonna launch into the meetings provisions again. If anything I touch on you want to go over, ask, just unmute and ask the question. When we talk about meetings, I'm going to read you, I don't read a lot of definitions. I'm going to read you this one. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Folks, the bottom line is that when you gather to do your work, you're having a meeting. You need to make sure that it's properly noticed. That means an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. If a portion of the meeting or all of the meeting is virtual, I know we've slid back to that in the last couple of weeks. There's a requirement that a 48-hour notice go out that tells everybody that there's going to be a virtual component. You need to make sure that the meeting is open to the public. And then you need to make sure that there are minutes when the meeting is done. A lot of times I'll get questions. People say, Tom, we've got some really delicate stuff to talk about, some really controversial stuff. Can't we just sort of go off in the back room and have a candid conversation before the meeting starts? No, you can't. One of the trade-offs from private to public is that you have to do your work in public. Hey, Tom, we're going to form a little subcommittee. Little subcommittee is not the full board. It's not a quorum of the board. It's only 2 or 3 people. That way, they don't have to consider the ramifications of FOI. That's not the case either. When we talk about subcommittees, the definition of public agencies are what are covered by this law. It's a long definition. I won't read it all, but in that definition is this phrase, including any committee of or created by. So if you create a subcommittee, even if it's only 2 people, if you formally create it, it's a subcommittee that has to follow the same rules. A lot of times people ask me about the quorum. They say, we don't have a quorum. Do we need to follow FOI? And we used to tell people you want to be careful about that. Supreme Court ruling last year, let's say it this way, would have you be a little less careful about it. But even if that's less than a quorum gathering, is conducting business and has been given some responsibility, that should also make sure that that work is done in public. You want to make sure that you're not setting yourself up to be vulnerable to a complaint, that you've gathered to do your work and you're not doing it in the public arena. The law talks to us about 3 different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. Regular meeting is a meeting that you have per schedule. I suspect many of you have turned yours in to the town clerk, and it says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, 6 o'clock library, whatever that is, that becomes your regular meeting schedule. Special meeting, frankly, is a meeting that is almost identical to the regular meeting. You need to produce an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. The agenda has to be specific, and you can do anything you need at either one of those meetings. So why are there 2? At a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on the agenda, you can vote to add it to the agenda. Special meeting, you can't add anything. So I don't know about you, when I make an agenda, I cut and paste items like other business, old business, new business. That's not the best agenda item, because the courts have really been after the FOI Commission and boards and commissions to make sure that agendas are specific, to fairly apprise the public as to what's going to happen. So at a regular meeting, you have an item like old business or new business. It's not the best, but then at least the chairman can say, is there any old business? And someone could say, yes, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add this item. You make a motion. Someone seconds it. If 2/3 of you vote to do it, you can add the item to the agenda. But at a special meeting, you can't add anything. So if you've got an item like old business on a special meeting agenda and there's nothing listed underneath, you might as well take it off. You can't do it if it's not specified on your special meeting agenda. That's the primary difference between the 2. So you can do anything you want at a special meeting. A lot of people say, well, we can't approve this. You can do anything you need at a special meeting as long as it's on the agenda. That's the fundamental difference between the 2. It's a good point maybe now to just sort of veer off to the sort of new requirements when it comes to electronic platforms, virtual meetings. We had started to shift back to in-person meetings, and now, with COVID ramped up again, people are going the other way. There's a couple things to remember. First of all, the key element with the virtual meeting is pretty much the same fundamental element for the in-person meetings. You've got to have access to everybody. So you need to put up a notice at least 48 hours in advance that says we're going to meet virtually, either hybrid or totally virtual. Here's the link, and we'll get you the agenda in the next 24 hours. The agenda does not have to be done 48 hours in advance, just a notice to everybody that the meeting is going to be virtual. If you're meeting totally virtually, you also have to take some other steps. You've got to make sure that you record the meeting and that the recording is available on your website within 7 days of the meeting, and that it's held for 45 days should someone want to see the recording. Another little wrinkle with electronic meetings, you put the notice up that you're going to meet electronically. Should somebody come, and Kevin, you know, I know this, you sort of cringe when I say this. Somebody comes to town hall and says, you know, my computer's broken, I need a place to watch the meeting. Technically, the town is supposed to set it up so that if someone doesn't have a place to go or needs computer access, you can give them access virtually from a town hall, library, school building. I haven't seen any instances of that yet, but that is in the law. Now, I'm telling you all this about the virtual meetings. This is from the, it's section 149 of the budget implementer that they passed in July of 21, Public Act 21-2. I'm looking to make sure I got the right number. And what's interesting is it all goes away as written by the end of April of this year. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but what we suspect is that they're going to come back next month when they come into session and make a lot of these provisions permanent based on what they've seen since last July. So, you know, the conversation about the virtual meetings will probably change come the end of April, but right now, these are the provisions that you have to be aware of. There are other different ins and outs. One of the questions that's come up a lot in the last couple of weeks is, you know, we noticed the meeting as an in-person meeting, and now we think we need to go virtual for the health and safety of the people. Can we do that? The answer would be yes, but the key thing is make sure you do it at least 24 hours in advance with the link. Make sure that that link is available at least 24 hours in advance. The law has a provision, pre-COVID provision, that allows a board or commission to change the site of a meeting should there be a safety issue. And clearly, going virtual and not in person could be classified as a safety reason. So just make sure that that is there. Publicize it as best as possible. Maybe put a sign on the door where the meeting was supposed to take place and say, look, this meeting is now virtual, so that clearly everybody knows how to attend the meeting. Back to the kinds of meetings. The third kind of meeting that we talk about, I really discourage boards and commissions from using. It's an emergency meeting, and it's a meeting that really you should only use in the direst of emergency. People are in danger. There's a safety risk for folks. The reason is that what you and I think might be an emergency might not rise to that level in the eyes of the law. The bar is really high. The law is constituted, it doesn't want us to meet in an emergency fashion because an emergency meeting is not noticed. Again, the idea is to tell people when you're going to be working, when you're going to be doing your jobs. One of the best examples I have of what not to do, next Monday is Martin Luther King's birthday. Some towns close, some towns don't. Inevitably, the Tuesday morning after Martin Luther King's birthday, I'll get a call. Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. I always bring my agenda to town hall or send it to town hall the Monday before the meeting. I forgot town hall was closed yesterday. I brought it in this morning. Is that okay? The answer to that is no, it's not 24 hours. It's not okay. Well, we've got way too much to do, and think of, your board right now. You've got a lot to do. The year's just heating up. So let's call it an emergency meeting. My advice to you is not to do that. Oops, I forgot is not an emergency. In our minds, in our non-legal minds, it might feel like one, but it's not. People say, well, what's the big deal? I'll brief the story down. Excuse me, but there was a situation around the western part of the state a few years ago where the Board of Selectmen felt that it needed to have an emergency meeting. Needed to have an emergency meeting because a member of the fire department had confronted the first selectman. The first selectman felt somewhat threatened by that confrontation. It was over the fact that the fire department person was not going to get a promotion. So they had a sort of an argument. First selectman calms him down and he leaves, but a lot of people heard about it. A lot of people heard the details. And they said, this is bad. You got to do something about him. Fire him or, suspend him. So the selectmen decided to have an emergency unnoticed meeting the next morning, which was a Saturday morning. They meet. And at the meeting, they decide, you know what? This guy's no good. He's a problem. We're going to fire him. So they fire him. The guy finds out about it when they go and they look for him all over town. They grab him. And he says, you blankety blanks can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting. They accept his resignation. Then he thinks about it a little bit. He says, wait a minute, what was the emergency? Why couldn't they have noticed that meeting, given me the proper, public airing of my grievances? So he files a complaint with the FOI Commission. And the FOI Commission decides that the town was wrong, that there was no emergency there, that there was no real threat to the first selectman, that there was no safety risk. And they rule against the town and declare null and void what happened at that meeting, which means that he now was fired and or quit at a meeting basically that didn't happen. End of story? No, because you can appeal an FOI Commission decision, sort of an indicator as to how, interpretive, if you will, this law can be. So the town appealed it all the way to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the FOI Commission and said, we too believe that there was no emergency there, and we also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. I want you to think about that for a second. Think about how long it takes for a case to wind its way all the way to the state Supreme Court. 3, 4, 5 years. And now the state Supreme Court is telling the town that the guy was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. Anybody want to take a shot at what the problem is? How much back pay do they owe him? How do they figure out how much to give him? All because, yeah, there you go. All because they didn't wait 24 hours to notice a meeting. Is this going to happen every time you misstep with a meeting or something like that? No. But remember, think in terms of how do I do it right so that I don't wind up in that kind of a jackpot? Wait 24 hours unless you have a true emergency, flooding, people in danger. And if you ever do, you hold the meeting, and within 72 hours, you create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. But again, my strongest recommendation is to avoid the meetings if you can. All your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can attend. One of the things that the FOI Act does not do is guarantee everybody the right to speak at a public meeting. I don't know if you knew that. Public speaking is in your hands. Who speaks, how long they speak, if they speak at all, the topics they speak on. Public speaking is controlled by the board. I get a lot of calls from people who say, well, wait a minute, they wouldn't let me speak. There's a situation up in Litchfield. I don't know if you've read about it. It's gotten some publicity. It's an argument over yellow ribbons on the trees and the green in Bantam, I think, the Bantam section of Litchfield. And some people called outraged that they weren't allowed to address the topic. The board decided it didn't want to hear it. Now, is that political difficulty for that board? Maybe, probably, but there's no FOI violation. You can control the dialogue, what you hear. And as we sort of shift back to the idea of virtual meetings, people say, well, I wanted to talk and they muted me, or I sent them emails so that they would read them. Folks, that's your call. Again, you know the topics, your people. I'm not encouraging you to shut down public speaking, but you have the kind of control so that you can get your work done. You can run an orderly meeting. And to the idea of people attending, I don't know, has East Lyme had any trouble with, if I say Zoom bombing, do you know what I'm talking about? Have you heard about that?
We had a couple of those where someone, inappropriate material, so.
Right. I had a conversation yesterday with a town, and they said the problem was this: they were recording the meeting much the way we are, and somebody, they don't know whether it was political or not, got on and started flashing pornography, cursing, and things like that. And their question was, could they cut that out of the video? They were able to shut it down pretty quickly. These are people with nothing better to do. These are people that are looking for a way to disrupt. In the beginning, back in 2020, these were people from all over the country with literally nothing to do. They were just calling up and jumping in, and racial epithets and stuff like that. You have a right to shut them out, by the way. Everybody has a right to attend. You have to provide access, but if people like that jump in, shut them down, you have a right to conduct your business. I've had it happen to me once doing one of these workshops. I'm doing a workshop much the way I'm doing it like this. It was a group of folks who are kind of like a League of Women Voters, people who are citizen activists wanting to find out more about things in government. And I'm talking like this, and all of a sudden the screen goes black, and this loud kind of reggae dance sort of peppy music comes on. Now at the same time, my oldest daughter is an international teacher. She could not get to her country last year, so she's teaching her first graders from my dining room, which is right below me here. So I figure the music's coming from her classroom. And all of a sudden she yells up the stair and she says, "Dad, what's that music?" And just as she yells that, the strippers parade across the screen. And shall I say, leaving very little to the imagination. And the poor people running the workshop didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to turn them off. They finally turned them off and we were able to proceed. I would argue that that's a more humorous Zoom bomb than some of the ones that I've talked to people about. But again, you have a right to control it. If the strippers wanted to stay for the meeting, they could have, but they clearly were just there to disrupt. So, you've got that kind of control. When we talk about meeting in public, I suspect many of you, if I say executive session, know what I'm talking about. Folks, remember that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not something that sits on an island by itself. People will call and say, "Tom, we've only got one item tonight. It's an executive session. Do we need to notice the meeting?" And the answer is yes. An executive session is part of a publicly noticed open meeting. So even if you've got that meeting and it's only one item, you notice the meeting, you convene in public, you call the meeting to order. Somebody needs to make a motion to go into executive session for one of the 5 reasons for executive session. You go in, you have your discussion, and then folks, remember to come out and vote. Do not ever vote behind closed doors. That's one of the biggest no-nos. You can talk all you want in the executive session, but always come out to vote. The 5 reasons for executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction. You are on a committee that's looking to build a new school. You're negotiating with landowners in town to try to, get the right price for the town, to try to find just the right parcel where to put the property. You have a right to have those conversations behind closed doors. You would not need to negotiate in public. So you could have the negotiations behind closed doors for the property. The 5th reason, something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. So you could go into executive session to talk about the contents of a record that are exempt. One of the best examples for a board or commission is, let's suppose you've got a project and you need to put out a bid. You put out a bid package, or you put out RFP package. They all come in. You want to review them. A board of education looking at transportation contracts. A building committee looking at contracts for, the project manager. You want to look at all those different ones. You want to sort of analyze them. You want to talk about them. Well, they're exempt. They're temporarily exempt when you take the bids in. You go behind closed doors in executive session because the documents are exempt, and you could have that conversation behind closed doors. Another example: you ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You, as the board, are the client. So the document is protected by the attorney-client privilege. You go behind closed doors to talk about the written legal advice that your attorney has given you. And those are just a couple of examples. That 5th one is a little broader than most. So you're able to have that conversation about the content of the documents. Back to the top. I went through the first 3 rather quickly. A personnel executive session. Some important things to remember about that, folks. Personnel executive session. First of all, those of you who prepare the agenda, do not, and make the motions. Executive session personnel is not enough. The courts have repeatedly told us that you need more information than executive session personnel. Executive session: discussion of the performance of a public works employee, discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the performance of a teacher. You then have to make really sure that you notify the individual in advance. The person has a right to be told that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. The person then has the right to come forward and say, no, 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 I do not want that discussion behind closed doors. I want that in public for everybody to see. And if the person insists on that, demands that, you cannot go into executive session. The person has the right to veto basically an executive session. What the person doesn't have the right to do, and many think that they do, is to demand that they go into the executive session. I have a right to be in there. They're going to be talking about me. Intuitively, that makes sense, but the law doesn't say that. The law says that you have a right to demand it in the open, not the right to demand to go into the executive session. So you notify the person, you go into executive session. Now, many boards invite the person in, which you're more than welcome to do. You can invite in anybody you want to give evidence, to give testimony, to hear somebody's side of the story. But it's never an obligation to invite anybody into an executive session other than members of the board. The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. There's a lawsuit that the board is responsible for. There's a CHRO complaint. There's an FOI complaint. You want to talk about your strategy. You want to have a conversation about how you're going to handle this. You could do that behind closed doors. The law also gives someone the opportunity, a board, I should say, to have a conversation about legal strategy. You're going to take action against somebody. Let me see. You're on a building committee and one of the subcontractors is doing a lousy job and you want to maybe pull the bond or pull the, take action to make sure that the job is done correctly. You don't want to tip your hand in public, so you could have that conversation behind closed doors too. The last one, the security executive session. That's one that I used to struggle to find examples for, but unfortunately a couple have come up. One, since Sandy Hook happened in 2012, boards of education in particular having conversations about resource officers, having conversations about escape routes, bulletproof glass, things like that. On the off chance that the wrong person is sitting in the audience, you could have those conversations behind closed doors. And another one that's come up a lot, like in the last year, cybersecurity. A town or a board of education has its system hacked and they have to close it down and they have to not only fix it, but then they have to figure out a way to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Well, again, discussing that security strategy in the public on the off chance that the person who did the hacking is sitting in the audience would be kind of foolish. So you could have that kind of a conversation behind closed doors. Again, remember, talk all you want, but come out to vote. Make sure all your votes are public and recorded in the minutes. Any questions about executive session? Sometimes there are. Anybody?
Hey,
Okay.
Tom, it's Sandy.
Yes.
It's Sandy Anderson. How are you?
Good.
Also, if people are passing out information in executive session, must they collect that back before
No.
they come out, or can people take that with them when they leave?
People can take it with them. Just having something in an executive session doesn't automatically make it exempt. If it's an exempt document, they can hold it back. But it might be a document that's not exempt that they would have to release whether it's in executive session or not. So collecting things in executive session doesn't really make a lot of sense. Okay?
Tom, is ex
Yes.
officio allowed to go into executive session with the board they're serving with, or ex officio yet?
Yes, ex officio members have a right to join in any board that they're attached to. Okay. Is there another question? Okay. In addition to executive session.
Joe Mingo's trying to ask a question.
Oh, okay. Unmute, Joe. How are you? I can't hear him.
Joe, you have to unmute yourself.
Now,
There you go, Joe.
I started 1983 Water and Sewer Commission. I have you made a comment about documents in an executive session. If you take
Right.
it, they become a public document.
What's that?
You have, my understanding of an executive session, if you have a document, a printed document in an executive session, if you take it out of the meeting, it now becomes a public document.
Unless it's still exempt. I mean, if you're in a situation, for instance, I mentioned the attorney-client privilege document, and you're discussing that behind closed doors, the exemption doesn't go away unless you waive it. So it doesn't automatically become public.
Okay,
All right?
misunderstanding.
So, folks, in addition to executive session, there's another avenue that boards and commissions can take to exclude the public. I read you the definition of a meeting. This one is one of those that you sort of left scratching your head. The sentence that follows the meeting definition says, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. And there follows a list of, gatherings, works, that everybody on this call, I bet, would say, gee, doesn't that sound like a meeting? And the legislature said, yeah, you can call it a meeting if you want, but for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not a meeting, which means it's not noticed, it's not open, and there are no minutes. Executive level search committee. You're on the police commission, the chief retires, you're looking for a new chief, you form an executive level search committee that can look for a new chief outside of the public spotlight. That one, if you think about it, makes a little sense. You're probably going to get candidates who are already employed, not wishing that their current employers would know. So you can sort of maybe understand that one. Collective bargaining. If you're on a bargaining unit that's bargaining with a union, that all takes place behind closed doors and nobody knows that it's going on. Again, that's a little puzzling. You think about how important that is, especially in a smaller town, how it impacts your budget. But for the purposes of freedom of information, not a meeting. Here's one that I always get a chuckle out of. Any chance meeting or a social meeting, neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. You're on a board and you're all buddies. You want to go out to dinner. You want to go, all those nice restaurants down in East Lyme. You want to go out to dinner together. You can do that, but you can't talk about official business. Hey guys, I know we're being recorded, but what the heck else are you guys going to talk about when you go out to dinner? You're going to talk about board business. Here's my advice. Please, please avoid the deep, deliberative conversations that you should be having at the table at a meeting. You're going to have a conversation that might touch on board business. Avoid it at all costs if you can, but the reality is you're gonna. Just make sure that you don't make the key decisions over dinner that you should be making at the table. I guarantee you, the one time you lose sight of that and get into a passionate debate at the dinner table, the wrong person sitting at the next table, and I know they're out there, and they're going to file a complaint that you had an illegal meeting. Be very smart the extent to which you have those kind of conversations offline. Let's not be naive. Let's be realistic. They're going to happen, especially in social settings. Do not set the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Please be smart about that. In addition to that, let's go back just for a second to the definition where it said whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment was sort of put into this law, back in 1975 for the telephone, for the chairman who gets on the phone and starts conducting business and tells one board member to do this and another board member to do that, and you're going to vote for this and we need you to make that. Okay, you can't do that. You can't have the meeting on the phone before the meeting takes place. And today we're using a lot more than telephones, aren't we? Emailing, especially when we're confined to home during certain periods of the last couple of years. Emails, text, Twitter, Facebook. I'm not telling you to stop using those platforms, but don't get into those conversations that you should be having at the meeting. Chairman sends out a document, says, hey guys, I really feel strongly about this position. I want you all to read it. We're going to talk about it at the next meeting. That's fine. But when a board member jumps in and says, I'm sorry, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then another board member jumps in and says, no, wait a minute, I like that idea. And then you're starting a conversation that you should not be having offline. You need to understand, and when we talk about records in a minute, you'll get this. Those emails, those texts become public records, and someone could ask to see them. So then you've got two problems. You've got the obvious problem that you may have had an improper meeting via email, and then you're also sort of some points of view, some thoughts that you might have that you weren't quite ready to share yet, are now out there in the public. So be smart the extent to which you use those devices to communicate amongst yourself as board members. And just remember, again, the thrust of this law for boards and commissions is to make sure that you do your work in public. The last piece when it comes to meetings is minutes. If anybody on the screen, just raise your hand. Anybody responsible for minutes? Anybody have that lovely job? I feel your pain if you do. I do the FOI commission meeting minutes. Here's my advice on minutes. They need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says. They are not verbatim transcripts. Oh, so many times people call up and they say, I wrote this big long and I wanted it read into the minutes. No, it's not required. You can if you want to, but I strongly urge you not to. Minutes should be a crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happened at the meeting. It should be meant to something that I can pick up and say, okay, I get what they were thinking. Here's what they voted. I get all that. And now I'm ready to understand through the minutes what happened at the meeting. But it's not meant to be a transcript, folks. And when people do that, what happens is they spend, way too much time at the next meeting saying, well, gee, I didn't really say that. I didn't mean that. Can we change that? Nice, crisp, clear, concise. Do the minutes, have them available in 7 days, and move on to the next event. That's really the smartest way to handle minutes. One other thing that I want to go back to, just to be, I was talking about things that are not a meeting, and I mentioned, the social gatherings and things like that. Another sort of component of that is the caucus. The caucus is probably one of the largest loopholes that the legislature wrote into the law. It allows members of the same board and the same party to have a conversation about anything at any time, at any place. Here he is talking to us for 45 minutes about meeting in public, and now he's telling us that the Democratic or the Republican majority of a board can go off and talk. The legislators did that. We can debate whether that was wise, but you can do that. The key with the caucus, folks, is to remember that it is only same board, same party. So the Republican majority of a board goes off to have a conversation. Well, let's invite in the town committee chairman. No, once that happens, it's not a caucus anymore. It's a meeting, and you've got a problem. Same board, same party if you're going to do it, and only then. I bring that up because it's on my mind, and an interesting series of calls today, 4 to be exact. A police commission not far from you was meeting, and there's a new majority. The board flipped in November, and it's now 5-2 in the party that was the minority before, and they were trying to make a motion and they couldn't figure it out. The chairman recessed the meeting. They went off. They got everybody on the same page, and then they came back and took their action. And the people who had been watching this board for years, 4 of them in all, called today and said, can they do that? And even though the optics are bad, even though I would not recommend that, there was nothing improper about what they did. They recessed the meeting, they put the meeting on hold, they went and had their caucus, and they came back. Not recommended, bad optics. If you're going to caucus, go before or after. But again, the law leaves a lot of latitude there for how you can caucus. Before I give you a little bit about the records provisions, does anybody have any questions about things relating to meetings? Anything you wanted to ask? Go ahead, just unmute and fire away.
One very quick question. You stated that to add an item to an agenda, it only requires a 2/3 vote of a commission?
Correct.
Okay, I was always led to believe it was 100%, so
Nope.
I'm wrong there.
2/3, correct.
And does that same law, while we're just briefly, apply to like condo boards, or is that only for municipals?
No, this law only applies to public agencies. A condo board would not be. So the condo board you're thinking about may have 100% requirement in its bylaws. We wouldn't cover that.
Thank you.
You bet.
I have a question.
Yes.
Trying to get my head wrapped around the subcommittee rules that we're talking about. You get 2 members of a zoning board trying to put together a text amendment proposal.
Okay.
And for example, the 2 members they decide to meet with the zoning official and come up with a plan. Zoning official puts it together and presents it at the next zoning board meeting.
Right.
You're saying that this meeting with these two zoning board members with the ZEO has to be publicized and this and that?
If those two individuals, those two zoning board members have been formally appointed as the text amendment subcommittee, the answer is yes. But typically what happens is the chairman will say, can you guys go work on that? And it's not a quorum of the full board, and then you go off and talk to the ZEO. I would argue that that's not a meeting that needed to be noticed. It's a subtle difference. I mean, for instance, a board of education typically has multiple subcommittees. Curriculum subcommittee, transportation subcommittee. Those are formal subcommittees that are formed and they meet and they have a schedule. I would argue that yours is less of that. And they're not really given any authority. They're just given the job of making something happen.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes, so you two guys go fiddle with that.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on meetings? Just unmute if you've got one, just unmute and fire away.
Hi, Tom. My name is Debbie. Can you hear me?
Hi, Debbie, I got you. Yep.
Hi. Okay, I just have a really quick question. There's 3 types of meetings.
Yep.
And then it says, then you had touched upon that everyone has the right to speak at a public meeting, and for how long? Like I noticed.
No, what I said was you control who speaks.
Okay.
The right to speak
So-
is not covered in the FOIA Act.
Okay, so should that be put in the agenda when it's noticed or no? Or how long they can speak is, I guess, is my question.
I would recommend it, that varies. If you're on a board that deals with a budget, at budget time, you may have a room full of people and you might want to say, hey, look, folks, we're not trying to discriminate here, but everybody's got 2 minutes or everybody's got 3 minutes. Those are the sort of things that you can do. If you know it in advance, putting it on the agenda is probably a good idea, but.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Just unmute and I'll talk a little bit about records. Joe, you've got your hand up. Let me hear you. Joe, I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Technology have changed the way. There was a time when you sent a note in and you want an agenda sent to your abode,
Right.
okay? By mail.
Yeah.
This seems to be changed now because sometimes it's done by email,
Right.
which may or may not work. And I have a problem with that.
If you want right now, for better or for worse, the law still says that you have to get it by mail. If a board wants to do email, the majority of people will be okay with that. But if the person still insists on mail, you make a written request to the board and say, I want all your agendas prior to your meeting by mail, then you'd have to get it by mail.
Okay. The second thing now, we have a new kind of meeting called a hybrid meeting.
Yeah.
And that's a meeting that's held in public, but there's also a situation where a member or a citizen can Zoom into the meeting.
Mhm.
And it would actually give them a chance to speak during that part of the meeting where they allow public questions.
Okay.
I don't know how, I don't know if the rules are gonna, I'm in a situation where I sit in a wheelchair. And it's very difficult for me because the town hall is very unhospitable to people in wheelchairs.
Okay.
What are those rights? Same?
Yeah, we cannot, the FOI Commission has no control over ADA compliance or anything like that.
Well, I understand
If
that.
if the meeting is hybrid, it means you can either go and attend it in person or link in on the Zoom.
Okay. That's all I want to know. And that's
Okay.
covered under FOI now.
That's in the new act that was passed in July. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let me give you a little bit about records, folks. Now, a lot of times, you know, the records portions, like when I talk to a police department or when we had the conversation with your town officials back in December, we could talk about records for hours, but as board members, you're probably not going to have too much interaction with some of the deeper in the weeds kind of issues with records. But here's what you need to know. When you talk about public records, the definition says public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, videotaped, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. The point I'm trying to drive home is every record you have, once you get your hands on it, becomes a public record. Whether you create it, whether you take it in as a board, whether you review something, whether you use it and then it goes away. Once you've used it, it becomes a public record. So what you need to understand is anybody could then ask to see that record or to ask for a copy of it. Now, if you ever get a request for a record as a board member, it's key to remember that you need to respond in 4 business days. Now, you may have a structure in East Lyme where there's somebody that handles that for you. You know, maybe P&Z goes through the zoning office. I'm not here to set that up for you. But if you ever get a request for your records, make sure that there's a response. Now, response doesn't necessarily mean to produce the records. It means, thank you for your request, we're looking into it, something like that. But always make sure that you've done that, because if you don't, the law says that the person making the request can file a complaint against you because you haven't provided any access. So always respond. Basically, it says that if you don't respond in 4 days, you've told them no. So always make sure you respond and always make sure that it goes out. Now, then the next question is, you know, what do we have to give out? When we look at records, there are many records that could be withheld. You know, I mentioned a couple of them when we were talking about meetings. You know, the temporal exemption on bids, attorney-client privilege documents, draft documents. You know, you're working on a draft, you can withhold that until you're done. Records that might be an invasion of privacy, records that might be a safety risk at release. The list goes on and on. If you get requests, have some sense for those, maybe call us up and ask us. But what I want to sort of drive home is it doesn't matter where the record is. Again, in the last 2 years, I've gotten questions from people, well, gee, we were working at home. I was using my own laptop. I was using my own desktop. It was my phone. Those are mine, right? If you create a record in the conduct of East Lyme business, it becomes a public record by definition, and you might have to give it out. If you do not want to see it on the front page of the New London Day, think about it before you create it, certainly, but before you send it, before you make it public, think hard, because once it's out there, in theory, anybody could ask to see it or get a copy of it. I suspect boards and commissions, you know, have somebody, I said this a minute ago, who's going to help them with this. If you don't, you know, maybe have a point person if we as a board ever get a records request, how to handle it. The point with records too is, because there's so many different exemptions and things like that, you're never going to know them all. So have some way to get your hands on them should somebody make a records request. I'm trying to think of one to give you a quick example of how one would work. There's an exemption in the FOI Act for records that are in a personnel file that might rise to the level of invasion of privacy. So it says what happened. So the New London Day asks for somebody's personnel file. Asks for, you're on planning and zoning. Asks for the CEO's personnel file. The first selectman looks it over and says, you know what? I think there might be an invasion of privacy here. You then go to the CEO, and the CEO says, you know, I agree, invasion of my privacy. So then what happens? It shuts down. And the only way the records get released is if the person making the request files a complaint with the FOI Commission, and the FOI Commission tells East Lyme, sorry, you were wrong, give the record out. There's 28 different exemptions in section 1-210. There's different state statutes that withhold records. So what I would also advise is if you take a look at any statute books, take a look at section 1-210 in the FOI Act, take a look at some of the statute books and have an idea, you know, what some of the records that involve the records you keep, so that if you don't have to just bang your head against the wall when you get a request for records. Rather than fumble around, does anybody have any questions about any specific records or handling records? Go ahead. I see your hand up.
Very briefly, when emails go back and forth between town hall and a member of a board, this did happen where each one of us on a commission were asked to turn over every single document that ever transpired between myself and the town of East Lyme.
Okay,
Am I required to save every email that goes back and forth?
great question. And it's not an FOI question, Dave, and it's a legitimate one. There are records retention laws in Connecticut that are an entirely different board, entirely different agency. And I would talk to my town clerk. I know Esther's not there anymore, but I talked to the town clerk about what needs to be retained and what doesn't. Emails that are transient can be deleted at will. Some need to be held for a certain amount of time, others don't. So the retention issue is not an FOI issue, but if you still have it when the request comes in, then you have to produce them. Any other records that you want to ask about? Sue, go ahead.
Hey, Tom.
Hi.
As a recording secretary, I will do recordings of the meetings
Okay.
in order to do minutes. Is that
Mhm.
a public record?
If you record it on a town machine with town equipment, the answer is yes. If it's your own personal device, the answer is no.
Okay. Thank you.
Is it John? You had a question.
Yes, on that example of the ZEO,
Uh-huh.
if the ZEO personal records is turned down by your commission, and the person requesting it goes to court, and the court says it has to be released, the court overrules the commission.
That's correct. We don't always win at court. I gave you an example where we lost, where we won, but sometimes the court disagrees. Goes back to what I said in the beginning about portions of this law are highly interpreted. And sometimes the court doesn't agree with our interpretation. So,
Okay, thanks.
yeah. Now, another thing to remember, a lot of times you'll get requests for records, folks, and you don't have them. Remember that you're never required to create a record that you don't have. You're never required to do research for people. So there are limitations. So the law is only about records that exist that you have access to that are not exempt from disclosure. Let me give you a little story here to show you, again, to try to drive home the point of everything becoming a public record. At the height of the pandemic, we have, we're doing a lot of work from home or via email or via text, Zoom. And so here's a law department in one of our major cities is looking for a senior legal secretary. So all the interview processes are going on. And the head of the law department sends the following email to a colleague. I would like you soon to reach out to, a woman's name is redacted, on behalf of the law department to thank her for her interest in the position and to inform her that we went in another direction. I feel that you have the most experience in our office handling these types of discussions. Tom pauses for effect. After many years of breaking off relationships with your past girlfriends and flings. What are you doing? What are you doing? You're the head of the law department. How can you do that? By the way, the email is entitled, Let Her Down Easy, Playboy. So even if you want to give the guy the benefit of the doubt, say he was just trying to be funny, I mean, that's outrageous. You can't put that into a public record. So now you're thinking, okay, how did Tom get that? Remember, everything's being done remotely. So the attorney who received it during a deposition in court that was being done remotely, and the thing popped right up on the screen and everybody in the court proceeding saw the email. Think before you send, folks. Think before you send, and remember, if it has to do with East Lyme business, it's a public record and it might find its way into the public arena. There is my word on that. Any other questions about things relating to meetings or records? Something that I didn't hit on that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, quick
Go
question
ahead.
about, you're talking about documents that get passed around through emails and such. I thought that when a document was in the process of being created, so it was marked draft, and if a number of people are sharing it to have their input.
If
in
you're
the draft
truly
document still-
right, if you're truly drafting the document, the draft exemption probably holds. I will share with you that the draft exemption can be somewhat elusive. One person's draft is another person's final copy, if you know what I mean. If it just needs a comma or crossing a T or dotting an I, it probably isn't a draft. But yes, the draft exemption is there, and if it's truly subject to changing and working up, then it's probably exempt at the time. Is it Jason? Jason has a question.
Curious, does the law extend to 501c3 organizations?
If the 501(c) is performing a governmental function, yes. If not, no. You know, folks, I'm going to be candid here. There are people who have taken to using this law as a weapon, as a means of getting back at people. Just so you know, we do not endorse that. We have tried with all our might to stop that. This law is very important to making sure that our democracy, operates properly, and making sure that people know what's going on. Democracy doesn't work if people don't know what's going on. But I understand that we are with you if you've got somebody who's making life difficult, using FOI as a tool to try to do that. We don't endorse that in any way, shape, or form. Anything else? Any other questions? We're just about at the end of the time that I told I would give Sandy. I'll stay all night if you want, but I don't think that's what you had in mind for a Tuesday evening. Joe, you've got another question. Go ahead and unmute. Joe, can't hear you.
The fines, is it still $1,000?
What? The fines, yes. The FOI Commission typically does not act in a punitive manner. Typically, the FOI Commission will say, don't do it again, but it can issue civil penalties of anywhere from $20 to $1,000 against the offenders. That's correct. The two biggest penalties would be the civil penalty, and I mentioned that story with declaring outcome of a meeting null and void. You don't want to be going down that path. You don't want to have a serious issue. You finally decided what to do and then have done it improperly and have it thrown out because you've done it improperly.
Thank you.
Anything else?
People can contact Sandy. Anybody can contact Sandy in the selectman's office if they want to get in touch with you for a contact number and so forth.
Right.
Like that.
If anybody who has a pencil or a pen, and again, folks, it's been difficult the last almost 2 years now. Some days we're in the office, some days they make us stay home, but I always retrieve phone calls. I retrieve them all day long. I was home today, I answered 25 calls. So the number is 860-566-5682. If you get voicemail, leave a message, I will call you back. Any last requests?
Thank you so much, Tom. I
You're
know we
welcome,
all
guys.
appreciate
Listen,
it, and it's very
have a
knowledgeable.
great night.